In this video, I will teach you every single checkmating pattern, so whenever you play a game, you will never miss a checkmate again. Also, you will be able to set up stronger attacks because you know what checkmating patterns they can lead to. I am always going to start off with an easy example. This is our first example, and then I will show you a more difficult one. And I really want you to think along with me and try to solve the exercises, because then you will have the biggest benefit from this video. So let's get started. The first thing you always do whenever we are calculating checkmates is basically taking how many squares the enemy king has left to move to. And I usually do this by actually marking the squares that they can't go to. So I know that all of these squares the enemy king already can't go to. So if we move our rook and we give a check, that's already a checkmate. And this is known as the hook mate. What I will always do after showing you an example is setting up a more difficult position like the one right here, where we can also do a hook mate, but you will have to do some calculation. Here we have a checkmate and 3 moves. So the enemy king, again, pretty much stuck between the pieces. All of these squares are already in our control, and basically the king can't go anywhere. So we just have to deliver a check. The way we can do this here, there's actually 2 different checkmates. One of them is going with rook to g7, which is a check. There's pretty much no move except capturing with the bishop, and then this also leads to a checkmate. There's also a checkmating pattern with f4 if you were thinking about that, but it is a little bit longer. Next up, we are going to take a look at the back rank checkmate, which seems pretty easy. This is whenever your enemy king is on the back rank. Usually there are pawns in front of the king, sometimes other pieces as well, and we just deliver a check amongst the back rank. The king can't go anywhere, so it's a checkmate. Something that many players forget is that you can also do a back rank checkmate on the side of the board. So for example, if you see this, you would probably not be thinking about a back rank checkmate. And I know it looks a little bit crazy with the 3 pawns, but sometimes you can have something like this, where for example this one is a rook, or one of your pieces is covering one of those squares as well, and then you can do a back rank checkmate but on the side of the board. Now we are going to do a small exercise for back rank, but I think this one is pretty easy. It's a checkmate and 2, and this is one of those really famous examples. You have to know that whenever you have 2 pieces attacking the back rank, or sometimes 3 pieces if you have an extra rook, usually you can try to force some back rank tricks, which you can do by taking the piece and then, for example, here delivering the back rank checkmate with your queen, or of course you can also take with the queen first and then deliver a checkmate as well. Next up, we have Anastasia's mate, which is demonstrated here, and this might look easy, but to get this you have to know a specific pattern, and knowing this is really important because I have been able to play this many times, but if you don't know it, it's really hard to spot this checkmate. This is the ending position that we want to go for, which is basically kind of like a back rank checkmate on the side of the board, because we are going to move our rook to h5, give a check, and as I said, there's only 1 pawn here, but the knight is taking away those 2 squares, and that is how we can do a back rank checkmate on the side of the board. But to get here, we have to sometimes set up the position. An example of 1 step further how we are going to set up the Anastasia's mate. So if you have a position like this, where the enemy king is in the corner, we already are cutting off these 2 squares with the knight. We have a rook and a queen present. We can basically sack the queen, force them to take, and then give a checkmate with the rook. And now this final example, you should bring together everything we have seen. And this is most of the time how we are going to go into this checkmating pattern. We have these pieces, and none of them are really close to the enemy king right now, but we can set up the checkmate. Usually because we can play knight to e7 check, and of course if we do this, it already takes away those 2 squares. The king is forced to move, then we sacrifice the queen, and then we can give a checkmate with the rook. So that is how you can do this, and this is the most advanced example of setting up this checkmate. Next up is the blind swine mate, which the basic example for this also looks easy, and that is usually when you have 2 rooks, or sometimes a rook and a queen on the 7th rank. And getting your rooks and queens on the 7th rank is very important, because usually there are many pawns you can attack, especially the g7 pawn, or of course the b2 pawn can be vulnerable for attack. You can just give a check, the enemy king has to move, we give a check, and then we give a checkmate, because the king is trapped behind its own rook. Sometimes you can also use this to force a draw, even if the rook is not there, especially when you are behind in a material. This can be useful. This is a little bit more advanced. Here we have a checkmate and 4 moves, and I hope you are able to see this. Basically, we just have to set up the blind swine mate, which we can simply do by playing rook to g7, and then we have to play a bit of a slow move, just our rook to c7. And we are not going for any checks, we are just doubling the rooks, and it's pretty much unavoidable at this point. Whatever black tries to do, we will be able to go for a checkmate. Okay, black can always delay one move by putting the knight in between, but in the end it's always going to be checkmate. Even if they try things like this, we can take the rooks, and in the end we will always have our checkmate. Next up is the double bishop mate, which you can do if the enemy king is in the corner. So the enemy king here is in the corner, it's also stuck behind its own pawn, which is important. This could also be a rook. No. The enemy king is stuck behind its own pawn, which is also important. So we can see our bishop is already cutting off the light square, escaping square. All that's left really is to make sure that we control this diagonal as well, which we can easily do by playing our bishop to d4. But sometimes to set up this checkmate, you have to do a bit more calculation. This is one of those examples of how we can set this up as well. And sometimes in these positions, it looks a little bit more complex. A lot of things are happening, but still, and many times you will be able to just activate both of your bishops down this diagonal. Here we also have a rook, which doesn't really matter for the sake of this checkmate. But it's important to look for this whenever the enemy king is stuck with a pawn in front of it. Next up is Boden's mate, and this is especially powerful to use against an opponent who has castled on the queen side. This is the basic idea. It's a bit similar to the double bishop checkmate because we are using 2 bishops, but here the enemy king needs to be stuck behind 2 pieces because otherwise they would be able to escape. One bishop is taking control of all the dark squares and the other bishop is taking control of all the light squares. But setting up this mate involves some calculation. And this is one of the key positions you have to really know if you want to get good at the Boden's mate. And this is a common theme if your opponent castled on the queen side. So we can already see we have this bishop cutting down the diagonal, and we have the potential to give the check with this bishop. But in our example that we have taken a look at, those 2 pawns were not present. So we have to try and remove them to open up the position. And usually you can set up a Boden's mate by doing a queen sacrifice. For example, queen to c3 is a check. There's only one legal move, capturing the queen, and then here we can do a checkmate because basically it's just the same zigzagging pattern with the bishops. Next up, one small example, which is Balestra mate. This is pretty similar to the double bishop mate, but instead of using 2 bishops, we use a queen and a bishop. This is more powerful, of course, because since we have a queen, there are no pieces necessary to block black's escaping squares. We can just use the queen and the bishop. And of course, this works with both colors of bishops. Next up, a very important one is the Arabian mate. This can happen whenever the enemy king is in the corner. We give a check with the rook, and the rook is supported by a knight. And it's very important this is a knight, because we also need to cover this escaping square on g8. And this is also one of those tactics, especially if you are attacking the castled king, that is really important. If you can activate one of your rooks, you can often try to go for the Arabian mate. This is a little exercise on the Arabian mate you should be able to solve. This is a checkmate and 3 white to move. So we already see that we have 2 rooks. They are participating, they are lined up, and we have a knight present. And as soon as you get something like that, you have to start looking for the Arabian mate. So the way we can set up the mate here is by using a pin, being that this pawn is actually pinned to the enemy king. It can't move anywhere. So what we are going to do is play knight to f6 check. They can't capture us, they can't go here as well, they can't go to this square, so they have to go to the h8 square. And I hope you can find it. It's a checkmate in 2. We play rook h6, check. Only one option, or basically 2 options, but both of them lead to checkmate. If they take this, we have an Arabian mate like that. And if they take the rook, we can do an Arabian mate like this. So it works, of course, in both directions. It doesn't really matter, but it's important that we have our knight as well, covering this escaping square and, of course, protecting the rook. Next up is another knight-rook checkmate, so it's important to know both of these, and this is the corner mate. But this only works if the enemy king is in a corner, stuck behind one of its own pawns. We are using a rook and a knight. The rook is covering this entire file, and then we are just gonna give a check with the knight, and basically the king can't go anywhere because it's stuck in the corner. So this also sometimes comes up when you are trying to go for the Arabian checkmate. This is another small example. This is a checkmate n2, so I hope that you can see the pattern. We already have our rook on the file, we already have our knight which can give a check. The only problem is that white still has this annoying rook, which is basically preventing us from going for the knight check. So we can just sacrifice the queen and then we have the corner checkmate. One other corner checkmate, which is known as Morphy's mate, is basically the same idea, but we are not using a rook and a knight, we are using a rook and a bishop. So pretty similar, I hope you can immediately see this. Bishop to f6 as a check, the king can't go anywhere, it's stuck in the corner. Pretty similar to what we have already seen. This is one of those examples of how you can set this up, and especially whenever you have a windmill tactic, which I explained in my tactics video, you can set up this mate, and that is giving a check with the rook. You force the enemy king in the corner, and I hope you can see it. Bishop to f6 is just a checkmate in one. Then another checkmate that we have with the bishop and the rook, which can also be done, especially whenever you have a windmill, is the Pillsbury mate. And it's just this, pretty simple. We are giving a check with the rook this time, and the bishop is covering the other squares as well. And here we do need the opponent to still have some pieces to block in the own king, but usually you can also try to attempt checkmates like this whenever we have the windmill tactic as well. Here a little bit of a more difficult example. This is a checkmate in 5 with the Pillsbury mate. So if you want, you can always pause and do some calculation, but I hope you can immediately see what we are trying to accomplish. And that is, of course, we have the bishop, we have the queen, and we have the rook all lined up with the g7 pawn. So I hope you can see the tactics. We can basically sacrifice the queen, black is forced to take, and then we take rook to g7. And this is the windmill that I have been talking about, which basically means that we can now, if we want, start moving the rook, and wherever we move the rook, we will always be giving a check with the bishop. But in this particular example, we have to be very careful, because if you think I'm just going to go for a windmill, that would actually be a big blunder. Just simply because the knight is capturing our bishop. So always do some calculation. If the bishop was not under attack, you could technically just start eating up all of these pawns with your rook. So how are we going to set up the Pillsbury mate? From this position, it's mate n3. We are going to play rook to g8, and that's a double check. Double check, so the only thing the king can do is move, and now we just have our standard Pillsbury mate, rook to g1, okay, black can block with the queen, and then this is checkmate. Next up, Damiano's mate. This reminds me a little bit of the pawn wedge we have talked about in the tactics video. If you have not seen that, you should definitely check it out. We have basically this pawn that is pretty close to the enemy king, controlling some squares, and this usually leads to many tactics. Here we just simply have queen to h7, and especially when attacking the enemy king on the king side, if they castled on the king side, if you can start pushing your pawns, it doesn't even matter too much if it's the f pawn, g pawn, h pawn. If you can push your pawns and get them really close and then also activate the queen, you will have many checkmating patterns in those positions. Here we have another example. This is another Damiano's mate, so you should be able to find this one. But here, instead of a pawn, we are going to use a bishop to cut off these diagonal squares. Of course, it doesn't matter. If this was a pawn, this would also work. So the main idea is here that, of course, the enemy king can't move. They can't really go anywhere. The only thing they basically have is this little square. So we have to go for a checkmate. So what we are going to play is rook to h8. And this would be a checkmate if the knight was not able to capture us. But since black has to stop us, we can just give a simple checkmate like this. And this is, of course, the Damiano's mate. And this could have been a pawn or a bishop, it doesn't matter. Next up is Lolly's mate, but I think you should be able to find this pretty easily. It's almost identical, but this is with a pawn that is controlling the g7 square like this. So here, just another quick example, and especially here, this is a good example, because I think many players here would think, oh, I can take this knight, that looks like a good move, but you would be throwing away your advantage, and suddenly the game would probably end in a draw, or maybe even black can make some comeback. So here we are just going to use the h-pawn, but of course we want to get the king to the back rank. So what are we going to play? I hope you see it. It's pawn to h6. The king has to go, it doesn't really matter. If they go here, we just have check and checkmate. And the most funny thing is, of course, if they go here, we just play queen f6, and black has a move, but no move that they can make will change anything about the position, so it doesn't really matter, we just have our checkmate. One of my favorites probably is this, which is the opera mate. So this is a combination with bishop and rook, where we give a check, and you can see that bishop and rook together actually control a whole lot of squares, but we do need one square to be controlled by an enemy piece. So if this was a queen, it would also work. If this was a bishop, it would also work. If this was a knight, it would not work, of course, because they would be able to capture our rook. And I especially like it if you can set it up like this. So I hope you can immediately recognize this pattern. This can sometimes be done if your enemy didn't castle quickly enough. So we have the queen and the rook lined up together with the bishop, but white also has one defender here controlling the d1 square. But we simply have our opera checkmate. Queen to d1 check, the bishop has to take, rook to d1, and that's just a simple opera checkmate. Next up is Anderson's mate. This is with a pawn that is also very far pushed into the enemy camp, but we are going to use our rook to deliver the checkmate. And here we really do need a lot of pieces, because first of all we need the rook to deliver some kind of back rank checkmate, but we also need enough pieces so that we can control the other squares here, so the enemy king can't escape. This square is controlled by the rook, but basically these two need to be controlled by another piece, and also the rook needs to be defended. If we had a second rook here defending this one and this pawn was not present, of course that would also work. Now, another position, this is a checkmate in 3, so I hope you can find it. You can pause if you want to do some calculation, but it's a pretty similar idea. We have the pawn here pretty far advanced, taking away some squares, so if we could get a rook here, that would be a checkmate. But I don't think that's going to be possible. We could also try to get a queen there, and that would also be a checkmate. So the best move here is just simply queen h4. A bit of a slow move, but this just sets up the checkmate, and it's pretty much unavoidable. White's trying to make a move, for example bishop h3, blocking, doesn't matter. They can push a pawn, doesn't matter. We still have the Anderson's mate. One other really fun mate, which I think actually comes up a lot whenever you are hunting the enemy king in the middle of the board, is the dovetail mate. And this is a mate you can deliver with the queen, and the queen controls so many squares, but of course the only squares that the queen doesn't control are those knight squares. But if your enemy has pieces on those squares and you give a check with the queen, it's simply a checkmate, because they can't go anywhere. And this is really common in king hunts. I will show you one more example here, and this is just a simple checkmate in 1. So again, we can see the king, and basically there are pieces like this, and as soon as you see that, you should be thinking, oh okay, maybe I have this checkmating pattern. Queen to f6, and that's just the dovetail checkmate. Then one more here. This is a small example for you that you can also try to solve as an exercise. This is a checkmate in 1. So we can see that we have our queen pretty close by, but there's only one piece blocking an escaping square. But the good thing is we also have our rook. So this is simply a checkmate in 1, queen e8, and all of a sudden, bam, the bishop is taking away these two squares, and the queen is basically delivering that dovetail's mate. And there are no pieces here, but we still have the bishop taking away those squares. Next up is Cozio's mate, and this is pretty similar, but it happens with the queen and the king. So I would say this is more of a variation of the dovetail mate. This is a checkmate in 2, so I hope you can try to solve this as well. White to move. We are gonna play our queen to h6. The king has to go, and this is basically pretty similar to the dovetail, except for the fact that we are using our king here as a protector for our queen. So even though this looks like black was winning because black had the extra pawn, this is just a win for white. One more similar pattern is the swallowtail's mate. So it's pretty similar to dovetail. Again, we are trying to deliver a check with the queen is protected, and on the squares that usually the king would be able to move to because the queen can't control those, there are pieces. But this is a bit different because we are standing in front of the king instead of attacking the king from a diagonal square. One more example here, it is black to move, and we have a checkmate in 1. We can see the enemy king, there are those pieces blocking the escaping squares, so we simply play queen to e5, and this is another swallowtail's mate. Another similar variation is the epaulette mate. which is whenever there's a king and there are two pieces next to the king, and those have to be rooks in this example, because I think if it's a queen, a bishop, or a knight, probably black will be able to get away. But here we just have a simple check with the queen. We control these squares, and again, it's those two squares that we can't control with the queen that are already blocked by other pieces. And here we have another example. It's again epaulet mate, but it might be a little bit more difficult to see because the king is actually now vertical with two rooks like this. But this is basically not an option for black since we already have a rook here. So we just have an epaulet mate, but this time it is from the side and the king can't go anywhere, and those pieces of course also can't block the check. Next up is the pawn checkmate, and pawn checkmates are usually a combination of other checkmates as well, because for a pawn checkmate to happen, most of the time you need the enemy king to be surrounded by a lot of pieces. Sometimes the king needs to be on the back rank, or in this example, we actually have three pawns blocking escaping squares. We have one pawn taking away this square, we also have the rook taking away this square, and whenever you see something like that, if you can just give a simple check, it's a checkmate. The thing is here, if we were able to, for example, give a check with a bishop, that wouldn't be a checkmate because black can always block. And that's one of the advantages with this pawn checkmate. We just push the pawn into the square and then we give a check. This is a checkmate in 2 that you should try to calculate, and it's also a pawn checkmate. So we can already see the enemy king is here. We do have the option of pushing the pawn, but if we go for this straight away, that would be a blunder because the enemy king can actually escape. Okay, we can take the knight, but black can take like this, and black is actually winning in this position. So first we need to make sure that we take away some escaping squares. So right now the king has, I think, only one escaping square, yes, because the bishop and the queen are already working together. But we have to make sure that we can take away this escaping square first. So you could play queen to e8, that's a check. Only one move, well actually 3 moves, but all of them are the same thing. That's what I mean, they have to block. But now we are taking away all squares, and you should be able to see this, checkmate in 1, pawn to d5. This is the pawn mate. Next up, also one of my favorites, but sometimes these can be a little bit advanced, that is the smothered mate. So smothered mate just happens whenever you give a check with a knight and the enemy king is stuck, surrounded by its own pieces, and sometimes also in the corner, but the king doesn't have to be in the corner if there are other pieces surrounding it as well. But there can be more difficult variations of this. Oftentimes for smothered checkmates we have to do beautiful queen sacrifices to force the pieces into place. So here we would actually like to play knight to f7 and say checkmate, but that doesn't work because the queen would capture us. So we are going to play queen to h7, the queen has to take, and now we just have the same thing, basically a smothered checkmate. Let me think. Yeah, this is another one. This is a checkmate in 2. So I hope you can find it because the enemy king is in the corner surrounded by the pieces. So then I'm always asking, where would I like to put my knight? I would like to put my knight here, but I have to force black to put a piece here and also free up this square for the knight. And we can pretty much do that in one move. Queen g8, rook has to take, and then we give the checkmate. And then one more example. This is a pretty advanced one. This is a checkmate in 6. So really good if you were to pause this and try to solve if you're interested in doing that. Otherwise, you can just watch this pattern unfold. So the idea is here that we have a queen and a knight on the same diagonal as the enemy king. And whenever that happens and the enemy king is in the corner or on the back rank, usually you can try to go for a smothered mate. So this pattern starts with the move knight to c5. We have a check. And of course, pretty basic, if the king goes here, that's immediately checkmate. So the king has to go to the corner. And now you will really see the magic happen. Check with the knight, and now we again have the knight and the queen on the same diagonal, but we also have the opportunity to do a double check. So this is double check. We have already calculated that if the king goes here, that's just a simple checkmate. So basically the king has to go to the corner. And I hope that you can find the right move in this position. This is checkmate in 2. Queen c8, rook takes, checkmate. So that was a checkmate in 6. And even though it looks a bit advanced, maybe difficult to calculate, if you know these basic checkmating patterns, you will be able to recognize things like this in your own games as well. Next up, we have Greco's mate. And I think this is one some players actually don't recognize because it's a bit awkward. We just play queen h5 and that's a checkmate. because the king is here in the corner and they can't go to the dark square because of the pawn, and we just have a check and we also cut off this square. It looks easy maybe right now, but sometimes, for example, in a position like this, I don't know if everybody would be able to spot this. So we have the rook attacking our bishop, we are defending it, we have the knight present as well. So the question is, how can we do a Greco mate? But we have to recognize the king is in the corner and we already are cutting off this square with the bishop. So basically, if we had a queen or rook on this file giving a check, that would be a checkmate. So that's how I try to remember this. So the right move here is knight to g6. That's a check, only one move. And then, of course, this is the Greco mate that we have already seen. Now we have the Max Lang mate, and I think this is in a way similar, but this is a bit easier to find probably. Here we just have queen to g8. That is a checkmate, of course, because we have the queen and the light squared bishop working together. And these two pieces are one of the most common combinations for checkmates whenever you are attacking the enemy king if they have castled on the king side. Now we are going to take a look at a bit of a more difficult example of a Max Lang mate. We are black and we have a checkmate in 3. So I hope that you can find this. So we can already see that the enemy king is here stuck. We have the queen close by and we also have a bishop. So whenever you see this, you have to start looking for this pattern. I think what many players would do, which would be terrible, is give the check with the queen here, because the enemy king is actually going to escape. And he's going to start running and we don't have a checkmate anymore. So we have to make sure that this doesn't happen. So what we can do is play the move. There are actually two moves, but the best move is bishop to g1, which is a check. The king can't go to this square, so they have to step here. And then we have this check, also making sure we are covering the escaping square, and then we get a checkmate like this with the bishop, or of course a checkmate like this with the queen. You could also, in the starting position, play queen to e5, and then the enemy king has to go somewhere. But if we take a look at this, the only way to still get a checkmate is to actually go back and then play like this again. But if you were thinking about queen e5, I don't think that's terrible, because at least you are thinking about checks and cutting off these diagonals. If they push the pawns like this, it's also going to be terrible because of check here, and then also a checkmate like that. Next up is the Blackburn's mate, and here we are using 3 minor pieces, 2 bishops and a knight to deliver a checkmate, and the checkmate just goes like this. The light squared bishop delivers the check, the knight is defending it, the dark squared bishop is also covering the other squares. So you have to be really good at piece coordination if you want to achieve a checkmate like this. This is a more difficult example, but here you can already see we have the 2 bishops and the knight close to the enemy king. So whenever that happens, you should be thinking about this checkmating pattern. So this is a good exercise to solve. This is a checkmate in 2. So the enemy king is already stuck basically. If all we could do was deliver a check to it, we would be winning. So how can we do that? Well, the light squared bishop is not really participating. Just imagine if we could, for example, go here and then give a check. That would be a checkmate. But the pawn is here. Well, if we play queen h3, that's immediately solved, because white has to capture, and we just have the Blackburn checkmate just on the other side of the board in a little bit of a different piece configuration. A similar checkmate, I think, as we have already seen before, is another bishop and rook checkmate. But we have covered this when the enemy king is on the side of the board or in the corner. But sometimes, even if the enemy king is still on a normal position like here, we do have the checkmate, which is known as Retty's mate, because we are just giving a check with the bishop and it's protected by the rook, and basically the king can't go anywhere. It looks a bit easy, but sometimes if there are more pieces on the board, players miss this option. But yeah, it's pretty similar. The king is already here. We have a rook on the open file. All we want to do is make sure that we are controlling this diagonal. So this is just a simple checkmate. A really fun checkmate as well is the Legal checkmate. And that is another checkmate where we have 2 knights and a bishop. And that's this. So the other checkmate was 2 bishops and a knight. This is 2 knights and a bishop. So with this we can also do a checkmate. We are just giving a check with the knight. The bishop is covering some squares and the knights are really working together to cover all of the other squares. And this is one that can sometimes happen in openings. I also have this in some opening videos where we are sacrificing the queen on d1. But then we have this position, and here we have a checkmate in 2. And I hope you can find this. I think it's probably pretty common as it is a well-known opening trap. That is bishop takes f7, king moves, and this is just the legal mate. We have some more to cover, so let's keep going. We are almost near the end. So here we have the kill box mate. We simply have the queen and rook working together, creating this kind of rectangle in which every square is covered. And of course, the queen is protecting the rook. If we swap the pieces, we would be in trouble because black would be able to capture our queen. One more variation of this, which is pretty similar to the kill box mate, is the triangle mate. It's pretty much the same thing. We want to think about this 9 square block and then just make sure we have a queen and the rook supporting each other, delivering a check. And here we also need the pawn to stop one of those escaping squares. Another position, pretty similar. We are already noticing the 9 square block and we just protect the queen with the rook and we have a checkmate. And our final checkmate pattern is the Vukovic mate. This is a checkmate in 1 where we have a rook covering the 7th rank. We have a knight covering the escaping squares, and we also have a bishop, or this could also be the king if the king was actually on this square, to support the rook so that the rook can give a check and the knight can block the escaping squares. And just like that, we again have a checkmate. This is a checkmate in 2 and it's also our final position. It is black to move, so you can try to solve this if you want. Checkmate in 3 actually, excuse me. You can try to solve this. So I'm always looking at the white king. Where can they go? Right now they have 2 options, and how can I give checks? But if I give a check with the rook, the enemy king is just going to start running. If I give a check with the knight, there are 2 options. That's what I was thinking first. If they go here, we just have a checkmate in 2. But of course, I should not forget that they can also go here. And then we have knight here, check. We force the enemy king here, and I hope you can recognize the Vukovic mate pattern. This is a checkmate. If you enjoyed this video, definitely subscribe. And as always, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.